Good morning, Denmark, and good afternoon, China. I'm very excited to be here and present my paper. My name is Vanting, and my paper is called "A Scoping Review of Deep Neural Networks for Electric Load Forecasting." And it is a paper that I've written in conjunction with my master's thesis, which I'm currently finishing up, which is on electricity load forecasting using neural networks and on a Danish residential areas. So I hope you will enjoy my presentation. I'm going to start by quickly going through the four points I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to set up what is the problem, why is there a need for this review, and I will then go through the methodology of the literature review and my findings, and then I will finally give some recommendations based on the literature. So before heading into the literature review, I'm going to set up the problem, and here I've brought a graph from my master's thesis, which is from a residential area in Denmark, which shows the consumption on the y-axis and the hours of the week on the x-axis. And we have these a blue and a red line, where the blue line is a January week, a typical January week, with no weird holidays or anything. So it's the last week in January. And then there's the last week in August to compare it with. So the problem is that when we deal with this energy data, that we have these very complex patterns that are never the same, like 2 days in a row. They might be similar, but they look very different. So we can see here there's an evening peak and a morning peak usually. And the evening peak is always higher, where we spend most of our energy when we come home from work in the weekdays, and the morning peak usually is reflected by breakfast time and showers and all that. And this, I think, it really shows how the data can reflect real life. It's very messy and unpredictable. So this is the first problem. There's these complex patterns that not every model can catch. Then we have another problem, which is the non-linearity. And usually the pattern goes up and down throughout a year. And when we look at the full spectrum here, this is just over 2 years of data for the full residential area. We can see how it goes up and down, and there's some weird peaks, which is around Christmas, and it goes very far down in the summer. And there can be so many things that affect this consumption data. So it could be weather, it could be national events or global events, it could be holidays, or just a change in our behavior. So I think, for example, this pandemic has changed our behavior in some way, which is also reflected in some data. And the final problem is the seasonality in the data. So throughout the year, I think you've seen it in the 2 previous pictures, that they are not the same throughout the year. So the consumption is much lower during the summer and much higher during the winter time. And there's this trend that it always decreases from spring to summer, and it increases from fall to winter. And we don't usually have these hot, long summers in Denmark, but it still reflects in the data, in our behavior, and how we consume energy. So it's very interesting to see this in the data. And what can we do to solve this? So one way is using deep learning. which I've focused on for this review. So how can we use this? Well, it is difficult to predict the exact consumption of tomorrow or the day after, as so many factors impact it, and therefore we need to make sure we use the best tools available for it. And this opens up a lot of opportunities for flexibility and grid monitoring if you look at short-term or long-term horizons. So in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of new applications of deep neural networks. It's skyrocketed what we used it for, and it's becoming more normal to use it in electricity forecasting as well. So to understand these state-of-the-art methods, I conducted this systematic literature review of deep learning applications relating to load forecasting. So this was a 3-step process to conduct this review. I started by searching in relevant databases. Then I filtered these references based on some keywords. And then I created subcategories for them. So the keywords I used seen in this word cloud, and they were also used to create subcategories, which I will show later. So the filtering was based on 3 factors. I first used these keywords. Secondly, I read through abstracts and discarded any that weren't relevant. And the third one was I discarded everything that didn't relate to deep learning. So any conventional method, statistical method, such as autoregressive moving average, I did not include, because the purpose was to see how do neural networks compare in this field. So these subcategories, they kind of emerged very naturally from the literature, and these were created on 81 references that remained after all the filtering, and of these 81 references, 59% of them were focusing on increasing accuracy. So how do we improve the neural networks? How do we create more better configurations, and how do we train them more efficiently? So this was a big focus of these papers. And then there emerged some 2 types of perspectives and 2 applications, major applications. So the perspectives were the grid perspective, which focused on how does the capacity of the grid look in the future, and the demand side, which was more of a flexibility view. How can we leverage demand side on the grid? And then the 2 applications were focusing very much on the building side, which was public buildings, industrial buildings. And then there was another one, which was a bit smaller, but this focused on household consumption, which include residential areas and single households. And these often focused on the occupant behavior and how this impacted the performance and what it did to the data. Whereas on the building side, it was very much focused on how can we implement this into, for example, a SCADA system, or what impact does the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning have on the data and on the model. So these were basically the 5 categories that I continued my analysis with. And after analyzing, I came to 3 major findings. The first one showed that there was a lot of advantages when combining two types of specialized neural networks. So what is called the hybrid neural network. And this combines convolutional layers with recurrent layers. And this first convolutional layer acts as an automatic feature extractor. So it doesn't really predict anything. It just extracts information from the patterns that we saw before, these very complex daily patterns. And the second one relates time and sequential patterns. So this would be your typical long short-term memory network or a gated recurrent unit. So I will briefly explain how this hybrid model works. I brought this typical convolutional neural network, but what we focus on is the first three boxes, which has the input, a convolutional operation, and the pooling operation. So I just took a picture of a dog here because it's easier to interpret when it's a picture and not a 1D grid of time series data, but basically it's the same operation that works, it's just in another dimension. So the data looks at the dog's eye, it convolutes it, creates a affine transformation and shoots it into the pooling layer where it's being reduced in dimensions. So what this operation does, it takes the most important parts in the data. It would be, for example, in our consumption data, it would be some peaks and it would be the valleys in the data. It would be a different pattern throughout the morning time where it's more flat. It could be many different things that it picks up, and then it pieces these things together into a big pile where it can combine the eye with the nose, with the teeth, and with the ear, and then it knows it's a dog. Basically, this is what happens in the 1D grid as well. And yes, it's very good to have this pooling layer as well because it reduces the dimensions. So it will be easier to compute later on. And for the recurrent part, this works as any other recurrent part. It takes advantage of these hidden states where it remembers long-term memory and deals with the short-term memory problem. So either you could use a long short-term memory or a gated recurrent unit. It doesn't really matter, and it works pretty equally. But the literature did say that LSTMs were more used in the research, which is pretty interesting because GRUs are very good as well. So I think they will be emerging soon as well in research. So this basically builds up a memory of the data that it gets from the convolutional part. So it builds up a memory of these important patterns, and then it predicts on a short term or a medium term horizon. To my number 2 key finding, what the network requires. So this focuses on the data inputs other than what is in the actual electricity load data. So here it requires a lot of feature engineering of the electricity load. So basically, at what time did a peak occur? In what month? What was the quarter of the year? So you get like the seasons and these different day and time features. They capture the seasonality really well and makes it easier for the model to predict. For example, in the summer, there's pretty mean load average, so load electricity. So it's easier for it to know when it's in the summer. And the second one is weather data, which also adds to this seasonality. It does a lot of things other than seasonality. It could also extract patterns from occupant behavior. So warm weather means you spend more time outside and so on. So this is also something that was always used as a data input. So that model is, the conclusion is to the model that it uses multivariate inputs always. It never uses just the load forecast, the load, electricity load, sorry. And the third key finding is that it is very difficult to compare these different models to each other because there are so many applications. So, for example, these questions arise about what are we actually looking at right now. There are so many different forecasting horizons, which is the first question that arose. And the second one would be, how is the data structured, sampled, or aggregated? Is it looking at a whole area? Is it looking at a single household? Is it in a 1 hour interval, or is it in 5-minute intervals? It depends very much on how it is structured and how much data there's available. So this is very impactful on the overall performance, because you have two models that look the same, but because they are applied differently on different data, they are very different in performance. And the last one would be the application. So is it a household or an industrial or a public building that we are predicting on? So the main conclusion here is that you can't compare all models to each other unless there's like a controlled setup where you have the same data inputs, the same forecast horizon, and the data is applied to the same type of building. So just to sum up these findings here, so you have these convolutional and recurrent hidden layers in the hybrid model, which show great advantages. Then your data needs some other input than the model needs some more input other than the load forecast. You need some feature engineering, and you need some external data. And thirdly, you need to consider what are you actually forecasting, which time steps is your data made of, how is it structured, how much do you have available, and which application are you forecasting on, because they show very different characteristics. So with all this in mind, I would like to present the recommendations, which are firstly, this hybrid neural network, which focuses on feature extracting and time memory, and then has multivariate inputs. And you can take advantage of either the LSTM or the GRU. It doesn't have a strong impact on the performance. And my second recommendation is to conduct a controlled test that compares different applications and different data sets and different constellations of neural networks to each other. So I have done a little bit of this in my master's thesis, and I can already see the difference in performance. So I think it would be good to have this controlled test that is conducted, testing these different impacts. So for example, short-term forecasting horizon is very different and is needed elsewhere than a long-term forecast horizon. So it should also be trained on these multiple data sets to see how different they perform, and both using hybrids and non-hybrids. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them.